A journalist mocked the royal guard, certain he could provoke a reaction to spice up his story. But with one precise, calculated move, the guard flipped the situation, uncovering a hidden truth that left the entire crowd speechless. Here's what really happened. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at this exact time, we're bringing you another powerful story of courage and discipline from the royal guards you won't want to miss. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of London like a shroud, and somewhere in the distance, Big Bench chimes echoed through the crisp air. But none of that mattered to Ethan Harper. He was hunting for content, and today, his prey wore a red tunic and a towering bearskin hat that Ethan had built his entire career on. Moments like these, finding the cracks in people's armor, exploiting them for views, subscribers, and that sweet ad revenue. His YouTube channel, Harper's Truth, boasted 3 million followers who devoured his confrontational style like wolves tearing into fresh meat. He specialized in ambush journalism, catching people off guard, making them squirm for the entertainment of the masses. This morning, he'd woken up with a singular mission: expose the ridiculousness of the Queen's Guard. In his mind, they were nothing more than overpaid mannequins, tourist attractions, in elaborate costumes. He'd done his research well. His version of research, which involved skimming Wikipedia articles and watching a few YouTube videos. He knew they weren't supposed to move, weren't supposed to react, weren't supposed to break character. Perfect targets for his brand of digital harassment. The palace gates loomed ahead, their golden bars catching the weak autumn sunlight. Tourists clustered around the entrance, phones out, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything that would make their London vacation instant. Children pressed their faces against the railings while their parents snapped endless photos of the stoic figures standing guard. And there he was, Royal Guard Charles Redford, though Ethan didn't know his name yet, standing at attention, rifle at his side, eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. The red tunic was pristine, the brass buttons gleaming, the bearskin hat adding an extra foot to his already imposing height. He looked like something carved from stone, a monument to British tradition and military precision. Ethan's predatory instincts kicked in immediately. This was it. This was his content. He pulled out his phone, switched on the live stream, and watched as viewers began flooding in. The chat exploded with fire emojis and comments. Get him, Ethan. Make him break. This is gonna be good. Alright, my beautiful chaos creators, Ethan said to his camera, his voice dripping with manufactured charm. Today we're going to expose the biggest scam in British tourism. These so-called guards, they're just actors in fancy dress. Watch me prove it. The crowd around him began to take notice. Some recognized him, the troublemaker with the camera, the guy who'd made headlines for his controversial stunts. Others were simply drawn to the spectacle, the promise of entertainment in what had been an otherwise mundane morning of sightseeing. Ethan approached the guard slowly, deliberately, like a cat stalking a mouse. Except in this case, the mouse was a trained soldier who'd seen things that would make Ethan's worst nightmares look like children's bedtime stories. "Hello there, tin soldier," Ethan called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Oh wait, you can't answer, can you? Too busy playing statue." The guard didn't move, didn't even blink. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point, as if Ethan were nothing more than a passing breeze. This only encouraged Ethan further. He moved closer, his phone capturing every angle, every moment of what he was certain would be his next viral hit. The live viewer count was climbing 50,000, 60,000, 70,000. The comments were coming in so fast they were just a blur of excitement and anticipation. "Come on, mate," Ethan continued, his voice getting louder, more theatrical. "Give us a smile. Show us that famous British hospitality. Or are you just a robot in a fancy costume?" The guard's silence was like a wall, impenetrable and absolute. But Ethan had made a career out of breaking walls. He'd ambushed celebrities outside restaurants, confronted politicians in parking garages, and turned private citizens into public spectacles. One silent soldier in a funny hat wasn't going to stop him. "You know what I think?" Ethan said, circling the guard like a shark. "I think you're not even a real soldier. I think you're just some actor they hired to stand here and look pretty for the tourists, am I right? Come on, you can tell me, we're all friends here." The crowd was growing larger now. What had started as a handful of curious onlookers had swelled into a substantial audience. Phones were out everywhere, capturing the confrontation from every angle. Some were filming for their own social media accounts, others were just documenting what was quickly becoming the most interesting thing to happen at Buckingham Palace in months. Ethan was in his element. This was what he lived for: the attention, the drama, the feeling of being the center of the universe for a few precious minutes. He'd built his entire identity around these moments. These digital gladiator fights where he was always the victor because his opponents couldn't fight back. "Let me guess," he continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You're one of those weekend warriors, aren't you? Play soldier on the weekends, stand around like a decoration during the week. Must be nice having the easiest job in the world." A woman in the crowd gasped. A child asked his mother why the man was being so mean. But Ethan pressed on, feeding off the energy, the controversy, the chaos he was creating. "Seriously, what's the point of you people?" he said, gesturing wildly at the motionless figure. "You're not protecting anything. You're not doing anything. You're just standing there like a very expensive scarecrow. At least scarecrows keep the birds away. What do? Bore tourists to death." The guard's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle. It was such a small movement that most people missed it entirely. But Ethan caught it, and his eyes lit up like a predator sensing weakness. "Ew, did I hit a nerve?" he said, leaning in closer. "Are you actually going to do something? Are you going to break character for me? Come on, give the people what they want. Show us you're human." The live stream was exploding. Over 100,000 viewers now, all watching, all waiting for something to happen. The comments were a mix of encouragement and disgust, people either cheering Ethan on or expressing their horror at what they were witnessing. But the guard remained motionless, a pillar of discipline in the storm of Ethan's manufactured chaos. His breathing was steady, his posture perfect, his eyes still fixed on that distant point. He looked like a man who had found his center and would not be moved from it, no matter what storm raged around him. "You know what I think," Ethan said, his voice getting nastier, more personal. "I think you're scared. I think underneath all that fancy dress and ceremony, you're just a scared little boy playing dress-up. I think you've never seen a real day of combat in your life. I think you're a fraud." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a gauntlet thrown down in the courtyard of the palace. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the other tourists, the ones who had been taking selfies and buying postcards, stopped what they were doing to watch start, and for the first time since this confrontation began, the guard's eyes moved. Just a fraction, just enough to acknowledge that he had heard, that he had understood, that the game was about to change in ways that Ethan Harper could never have imagined. The shift was subtle at first, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to change. The guard's stance remained perfect, his position unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere around him. It was as if a sleeping giant had opened one eye, and the world had suddenly become a much more dangerous place. Ethan, drunk on his own perceived power, pressed his advantage. He'd made a career out of pushing people past their breaking points, and he was certain he was close to achieving another victory. The views were climbing, the comments were flowing, and he could practically feel the ad revenue rolling in. "That's what I thought," he said, his voice dripping with false victory. "Nothing to say because there's nothing to say. You're a fake, a pretender, a man playing at being a soldier while real heroes do the actual work." The guard's breathing remained steady, but there was something different about his stillness now. It wasn't the passive immobility of a tourist, the attraction or the practiced discipline of a ceremonial position. It was the dangerous quiet of a predator choosing its moment, the calm before devastation. "You want to know what real courage looks like?" Ethan continued, his voice getting louder as his confidence grew. "It's what I'm doing right now, standing up to the establishment, speaking truth to power, exposing the lies and pretense that keep people fooled. That's real bravery, not standing around in a costume pretending to be something you're not." A teenager in the crowd laughed, caught up in the spectacle. An elderly gentleman shook his head in disgust. A mother pulled her child closer, sensing that something was about to go terribly wrong. "I bet you've never even left London," Ethan said, warming to his theme. "I bet the closest you've come to real combat is watching war movies on Netflix. I bet you signed up for this job thinking it would be easy money, standing around all day, getting your picture taken with tourists." The guard's eyes flickered again, and this time Ethan caught it. He saw something in those eyes that made him pause for just a moment, a depth, a darkness, a weight of experience that spoke of things far beyond anything Ethan had ever encountered. But arrogance is a powerful drug, and Ethan was deep in its grip. He interpreted the guard's reaction as weakness, as a crack in the facade that he could exploit. "Come on then," he said, moving even closer, his phone just inches from the guard's face. "Tell me about your military service. Tell me about all the battles you've fought, all the enemies you've faced. Tell me about your war stories, soldier boy." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something that would either be legendary or catastrophic. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife, and everyone present knew that they were about to witness either the greatest victory or the most spectacular failure in Ethan Harper's career. And then, in a voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear it, the guard spoke. "Afghanistan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of sand and blood and memories that would never fade. "2 tours, Helmand Province." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. Ethan's smile faltered for just a moment, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "Sure you were, mate," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I'm the bloody Queen of England. You expect me to believe that Mr. Statue here is some kind of war hero? Pull the other one. It's got bells on it." The guard's eyes met Ethan's for the first time, and in that moment, the journalist felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine fear. Those eyes held depths that spoke of things no amount of YouTube views could ever prepare him for. The confrontation had reached a tipping point, like a dam about to burst under the pressure of too much water. Ethan, his confidence shaken but not broken, doubled down on his attack. He'd built his entire career on the principle that everyone would eventually crack under enough pressure, and he wasn't about to let one silent soldier prove him wrong. "Prove it then," he said, his voice getting shriller as he sensed the crowd's mood beginning to shift. "If you're such a war hero, prove it. Show me your medals. Tell me your stories. Give me something real instead of just standing there like a shop mannequin." The guard's silence stretched on, but it was different now. It wasn't the passive quiet of someone ignoring a pest. It was the purposeful silence of someone choosing their moment, selecting their words with the precision of a sniper choosing his shot. "You know what I think happened?" Ethan continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard as he played to his audience, both live and in person. "I think you washed out. I think you couldn't hack it in the real military, so they stuck you here where you can't do any damage. Safe little job for a safe little man." A murmur ran through the crowd, but it wasn't the supportive rumble Ethan was used to. There was something different in the air now, a shift in the atmosphere that he was too absorbed in his own performance to notice. 23rd Regiment, the guard said suddenly, his voice cutting through Ethan's monologue like a blade. "Special Air Service, Operation Herrick, IED disposal. Lost 3 men in my unit to a roadside bomb outside Lashkar. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Suddenly, phones were lowering, expressions were changing, and the mood in the courtyard shifted from anticipation to something much more uncomfortable. Ethan blinked, momentarily thrown off his rhythm. The guard's voice had carried an authenticity that was impossible to fake, a weight of experience that spoke of things far beyond anything Ethan had ever encountered. But his ego wouldn't let him back down. "Anyone can memorize some military jargon," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You could have looked that up on Google. Hell, you probably did look it up on Google, knowing some troll like me would eventually show up to test you." The guard's eyes never left Ethan's face, and in them, the journalist saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't anger or hatred or even contempt. It was pity, the look of a man who had seen real evil, real suffering, real courage, looking at someone who had never been tested by anything more challenging than a bad Wi-Fi connection. "You want proof," the guard said, his voice so quiet that the crowd had to strain to hear it. "You want to know what real service looks like. It's not standing here because it's easy. It's standing here because after everything I've seen, after everything I've done, I still believe in something worth protecting." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even Ethan's live stream chat had gone quiet, the flood of comments reduced to a trickle of stunned emotion. "But you wouldn't understand that," the guard continued, his voice still soft but carrying across the courtyard like a whisper that everyone somehow heard. "You've never protected anything in your life. You've never stood between danger and the people you love. You've never held a dying friend in your arms while mortar fell around you." Ethan's phone was shaking in his hand now, though he tried to hide it. Something about the guard's quiet certainty was more unnerving than any shouting match or violent confrontation could have been. "You make money destroying people," the guard said, his eyes boring into Ethan's soul. "You take their worst moments and turn them into entertainment. You feed off chaos and pain and humiliation. That's not journalism, that's parasitism." The crowd around them had grown to over 100 people now, drawn by the drama unfolding before them, but the mood had shifted completely from the beginning of the confrontation. What had started as entertainment had become something much more serious, much more real. Ethan tried to regain control of the narrative, but his usual weapons, sarcasm, aggression, manufactured outrages, seemed suddenly inadequate against the guard's quiet dignity. "That's rich, coming from someone who gets paid to stand around in a costume," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier fire. "At least I'm honest about what I do. I don't pretend to be something I'm not." The guard's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes now that made Ethan want to step back, to put distance between himself and this man who radiated a kind of quiet authority that no amount of YouTube subscribers could match. "You want to know what I am?" the guard said, his voice still soft but carrying an edge that made the crowd leaning closer. "I'm a soldier who's seen what happens when good people do nothing. I'm a man who's stood in places where civilization ends and chaos begins. I'm someone who's chosen to keep standing, even when it would be easier to fall." A woman in the crowd wiped away a tear. A veteran in the back straightened his shoulders and nodded in recognition. Even the teenagers who had been laughing earlier were now silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple confrontation. "And you," the guard continued, his gaze never leaving Ethan's face, "you're a man who profits from other people's pain. You're a parasite who feeds on controversy and chaos. You're everything that's wrong with the world today, wrapped up in a designer jacket and armed with a smartphone." The words hit Ethan like physical blows. He'd been called names before, been criticized, been attacked online and in person, but this was different. This wasn't angry ranting or emotional outburst. This was a calm, measured assessment delivered with the authority of someone who had earned the right to judge. "You think this is just a job?" the guard asked, gesturing. to his uniform, his position, his post. You think this is just standing around for tourists. This is remembering, this is honoring. This is standing guard over something that matters more than clicks and views and advertising revenue. Ethan's live stream was hemorrhaging viewers now, but not in the way he was used to. They weren't leaving because they were bored or because the content wasn't engaging enough. They were leaving because they were uncomfortable, because they were witnessing something that felt too real, too personal, too much like actual truth instead of manufactured drama. You came here looking for a reaction, the guard said, his voice carrying a finality that made everyone present realize that this confrontation was nearing its end. You wanted to break me, to make me crack, to turn me into content for your channel, but you made a mistake. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the final blow. You assumed I was weak because I choose to be silent. You assumed I was fake because I choose to serve. You assumed I was nothing because I don't need to prove myself to people like you. The guard's eyes swept over the crowd, taking in the faces of the tourists, the locals, the veterans, the children who had been watching this entire drama unfold. But the biggest mistake you made, he said, his voice now carrying clearly across the courtyard, was assuming that I don't know exactly who you are. The moment hung in the air like a sword suspended over Ethan's head. The guard's words had carried a weight that suggested he knew far more than he was letting on, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, Ethan felt genuinely afraid. You're Ethan Harper, the guard said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had characterized his entire response. Channel name, Harper's Truth, 3.2 million subscribers, known for ambush journalism, controversial stunts, and monetizing other people's misery. Ethan's mouth went dry. This wasn't supposed to happen. The guards weren't supposed to know things, weren't supposed to be aware of the world beyond their ceremonial posts. They were supposed to be nothing more than tourist attractions, living statues in elaborate costumes. You're the man who fabricated the story about the Manchester orphanage fire, the guard continued, his voice never rising above a conversational level but somehow carrying to every person in the increasingly large crowd. Made up quotes from firefighters, invented heart-wrenching details about children in danger, all to boost your view count. The crowd stirred murmurs of recognition and disgust beginning to ripple through the assembled tourists. Phones that had been recording Ethan's performance were now turning toward him with a very different kind of interest. That's not Ethan, started, but the guard's quiet voice cut through his protest like a knife through silk. Received a cease and desist letter from the Manchester Fire Department, forced to issue a public retraction, paid an undisclosed settlement to the charity you defamed. All public record, all easily verifiable. The color drained from Ethan's face, his carefully constructed public persona, built on the foundation of being a fearless truth-teller, was crumbling in real time in front of hundreds of people and thousands of live-stream viewers. You want to talk about fake? The guard asked, his voice still soft but now carrying an edge that made everyone listening feel the weight of his words. You want to talk about pretending to be something you're not? You built your entire career on lies, manipulation, and exploitation. You've never told the truth in your life when a lie would get you more views. A woman in the crowd shouted shame. Another person began recording specifically to capture Ethan's reaction. The mood had shifted completely now, from entertainment to justice, from spectacle to accountability. You came here today looking for content, the guard continued, his eyes never leaving Ethan's increasingly pale face. You wanted to make me look foolish, to expose me as some kind of fraud, but the only fraud here is you. The only pretender here is you. The only person playing a role they're not qualified for is you. Ethan's phone was shaking so badly in his hand that the live stream was nearly unwatchable. His viewer count was plummeting as word spread across social media about who he really was and what he had really done. I stand here because I choose to serve, the guard said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of absolute truth. I wear this uniform because I've earned the right to wear it. I maintain this post because I believe in something bigger than myself. What do you stand for, Mr. Harper? What do you believe in besides your own self-promotion? The question hung in the air like a challenge, but it was clear that no answer was expected. The guard had made his point, delivered his verdict, and rendered his judgment. The court of public opinion had heard the evidence and reached its conclusion. You mock service while profiting from chaos, the guard said, his voice now carrying a note of finality that made everyone present realize that this confrontation was nearing its end. You sneer at honor while wallowing in dishonor. You attack dignity while possessing none yourself. The crowd was completely silent now, watching as one man's carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of truth delivered with surgical precision. The aftermath of the guard's revelation spread through the crowd like wildfire. Phones were buzzing with notifications as people looked up Ethan's history, sharing articles and videos about his past controversies. The Manchester orphanage story was being pulled up on social media, shared and reshared as the truth about Ethan Harper's journalism spread in real time. Ethan himself stood frozen, his phone still streaming live to a rapidly dwindling audience. The comment section that had earlier been filled with encouragement and excitement was now a torrent of disgust and outrage. Fake news, Fraud scrolled past repeatedly, mixed with angry emojis and calls for his channel to be shut down. The thing about truth, the guard said, his voice cutting through the digital chaos surrounding them, is that it has a way of coming out. You can bury it, distort it, profit from its absence, but eventually it surfaces. And when it does, all the lies in the world can't protect you from it. A veteran in the crowd stepped forward, his own military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Thank you for your service," he said to the guard, his voice carrying across the courtyard both overseas and here at home. The guard nodded. Once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any elaborate gesture could have. "Just doing my job, sir." "Your job," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain some control over the situation, "is to stand there and look pretty for tourists. That's all you are. That's all any of this is." But the words fell flat, carrying none of their earlier venom. The crowd looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust, the way people might look at a drunk who had just embarrassed himself at a family gathering. "My job," the guard said, his voice patient but firm, "is to honor the memory of those who came before me, to stand guard over the values they died protecting, to represent something bigger than myself, something worth preserving." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before settling back on Ethan's face. "Your job, apparently, is to tear down anything that reminds people that honor still exists in the world, to reduce everything noble to entertainment, everything sacred to content, everything meaningful to clicks and views." The crowd murmured its agreement, phones still recording but now focused entirely on capturing the guard's words rather than Ethan's humiliation. "You want to know what the difference is between us?" the guard asked, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone listening feel the gravity of the moment. "I've seen what happens when civilization fails. I've stood in places where there are no rules, no law, no protection except what good people are willing to provide. I've seen what the world looks like when people like me don't do our jobs." The courtyard was so quiet that the distant sounds of London traffic seemed intrusive, inappropriate for the solemnity of the moment. "And you," the guard continued, his gaze never leaving Ethan's face, "you're part of what tears civilization down. You profit from division, feed on controversy, grow stronger when people are weaker. You're not a journalist. You're not a truth-teller. You're a symptom of a sick society that values entertainment over integrity." A child in the crowd asked his mother what was happening. She whispered something about a bad man learning an important lesson. The child nodded solemnly, sensing that he was witnessing something significant even if he couldn't fully understand it. "I've stood my ground in places where standing meant the difference between life and death," the guard said, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience. "Standing here, in this place, protecting these values, it's not just a job. It's a continuation of that same mission. It's a reminder that some things are worth protecting, even from people like you." The revelation of Ethan's past had transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. What had begun as a one-sided attack on a silent target had become a masterclass in dignity under pressure, a demonstration of how truth, when wielded with precision and authority, could cut through any amount of bluster and manufactured outrage. Ethan's livestream had become a monument to his own downfall. The viewer count had dropped to a fraction of its peak, and those who remained were there not to support him but to witness his humiliation. The comments section had become a torrent of criticism, with people sharing screenshots of his past controversies and calling for accountability. "You know what I realized, watching you perform today?" the guard said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had found his truth and was comfortable sharing it. "You're not really here to expose me. You're here to distract from yourself. You attack others to avoid examining your own failures. You create chaos to avoid confronting the emptiness of your own existence." The words hit Ethan like physical blows. He'd built his entire identity around being the attacker, the one who exposed others' weaknesses and failures. Being on the receiving end of that same treatment was revealing just how devastating his own methods could be. Every person you've ambushed, every reputation you've destroyed, every life you've disrupted for content, they all had stories, had purposes, had value beyond what you could extract from them. But you never saw that, did you? You only saw opportunities for exploitation. A woman in the crowd was crying now, apparently reminded of her own encounter with predatory journalism. Others were nodding in recognition, seeing their own experiences reflected in the guard's words. "I protect things," the guard said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of absolute conviction. "I protect tradition, honor, memory, values. I stand between what matters and those who would destroy it for profit. That's what service means, that's what duty means, that's what sacrifice means." The crowd was completely absorbed now, no longer watching a confrontation but witnessing a lesson in the difference between substance and spectacle, between service and self. "And you," the guard continued, his eyes boring into Ethan's soul, "you destroy things. You take whatever trust people have in institutions, in each other, in the possibility of truth itself, and you turn it into entertainment. You make the world a little bit worse every day, and you call it success." Ethan tried to speak, tried to mount some kind of defense, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in his career, he was facing someone who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be provoked, couldn't be reduced to a soundbite or a reaction video. "You came here thinking you could expose me as a fraud," the guard said, his voice now carrying a note of finality that made everyone present realize that this confrontation was nearing its end. "But the only thing you've exposed is yourself. The only fraud here is you. The only person pretending to be something they're not is you." The crowd murmured its agreement. Phones still recording but now focused entirely on capturing the guard's words rather than Ethan's humiliation. "I stand here by choice," the guard said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I serve by choice. I protect by choice. I maintain this post not because I have to, but because I choose to, because I believe in something bigger than myself." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "What do you choose, Mr. Harper? What do you believe in? What do you stand for when nobody's watching, when there's no camera rolling, when there's no audience to perform for?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but it was clear that no answer was expected. The guard had made his point, delivered his verdict, and rendered his judgment. The silence that followed the guard's final question was deafening. It wasn't the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for the next act in a performance. It was the heavy silence of a moment when truth had been spoken, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something significant. Ethan stood there, his phone still streaming to a handful of remaining viewers, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. His entire persona, his carefully constructed image as a fearless truth-teller, had been systematically dismantled by a man who had never raised his voice, never lost his composure, never stooped to the level of personal attack that defined Ethan's own methods. The crowd began to disperse, but not in the way crowds usually scatter after a spectacle. They moved quietly, thoughtfully, many of them still processing what they had witnessed. Some approached the guard to thank him, to acknowledge his service, to express their respect for what he represented. Others simply nodded as they passed, a gesture of recognition from one decent person to another. Ethan found himself increasingly alone, his audience melting away like snow in the sun. The tourists who had been drawn by the promise of entertainment had stayed for the lesson in dignity. But now they were moving on, leaving him standing there with his phone and his failure and his rapidly crumbling reputation. "You know what the saddest part is?" the guard said, his voice now conversational rather than confrontational, as if he was speaking to a friend rather than an adversary. "You could have been something better. You have a platform, an audience, a voice that reaches millions of people. You could have used that power to lift people up, to tell stories that matter, to shine light on injustice and corruption and abuse of power." Ethan looked up, surprised by the change in tone, by the unexpected note of what almost sounded like compassion in the guard's voice. "Instead, you chose to tear people down. You chose to profit from humiliation and chaos and division. You chose to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution." The guard's eyes met Ethan's, and for a moment, the journalist saw something in them that was almost worse than anger or contempt. Genuine sadness for a life wasted, a potential squandered, a person who had chosen the wrong path and might never find their way back. "It's not too late," the guard said, his voice soft enough that only Ethan could hear it. "You could choose differently. You could use your platform for something that matters. You could stop being part of what's wrong with the world and start being part of what's right with it." For a moment, just a moment, Ethan felt something shift inside him. The guard's words had found their mark, not in the way his usual attacks were designed to wound, but in the way that truth sometimes penetrates even the most carefully constructed defenses. But then his phone buzzed with a notification, and he saw that his subscriber count had dropped by thousands in just the past hour. The practical reality of his situation reasserted itself, and the moment of possibility passed. "I don't need advice from a guy in a costume," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and everyone present could hear the defeat in it. The guard nodded, as if he had expected this response, as if he had seen this same choice made badly by many people before. "No," he said quietly, "I don't suppose you do." The final minutes of the confrontation were almost anticlimactic. Ethan, his bravado exhausted and his audience gone, began to back away from the guard, from the crowd, from the scene of his humiliation. His phone was still streaming, but to an audience of hundreds rather than hundreds of thousands. And those who remained were there not to support him but to witness his downfall. "This isn't over," he said, but the words carried no threat, no promise of future revenge. They were the empty bluster of a man who had been thoroughly defeated and was trying to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his reputation. The guard didn't respond. He had already said everything that needed to be said, made every point that needed to be made. He simply resumed his position, his posture perfect, his eyes once again fixed on that distant point that only he could see. The crowd continued to disperse, but many lingered, taking photos with the guard, thanking him quietly for his service, for his dignity, for the lesson he had taught them all. Children who had been frightened by Ethan's aggressive behavior now approached cautiously, their parents encouraging them to show respect for the man who had demonstrated what true strength looked like. Ethan slunk away, his shoulders hunched, his phone finally silent. The live stream had ended not with a bang but with a whimper, his audience having abandoned him for someone who represented everything he was not: honor, integrity, purpose, and the quiet courage to stand for something bigger than himself. As the last of the tourists moved on, as the normal rhythm of London life reasserted itself around the palace gates, the guard remained. He stood there as he had stood there every day for months, as guards had stood there for decades, as they would continue to stand there long after Ethan Harper's moment of internet fame had been forgotten. But something had changed. The guard's silence was no longer just the absence of speech, it was the presence of dignity. His stillness was no longer just a requirement of his position, it was the embodiment of purpose. His uniform was no longer just a costume, it was the visible symbol of everything that separates civilization from chaos, service from selfishness, honor from exploitation. The morning sun climbed higher over London, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben chimed the hour. Tourists continued to arrive, phones out, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything that would make their London vacation memorable. And the guard stood there, protecting not just a building or a tradition but an idea, that some things are worth defending, that some values are worth preserving, that some people are still willing to stand between what matters and those who would destroy it for profit. The confrontation was over, but its impact would ripple outward for days, weeks, months to come. Videos of the encounter would be shared millions of times, not as entertainment but as education, not as spectacle but as inspiration. People would remember the quiet dignity of the guard, the devastating precision of his words, the way he had turned a moment of intended humiliation into a masterclass in grace under pressure. And they would remember Ethan Harper too, but not in the way he had hoped. He would be remembered as the man who tried to tear down something beautiful and discovered that some things cannot be torn down, some people cannot be broken, some values cannot be monetized or exploited or reduced to content. The guard's victory was complete, but it was not the victory of conquest or domination. It was the victory of truth over falsehood, of substance over spectacle, of service over self. It was the victory of a man who had found his purpose and was willing to stand by it, no matter what storm raged around him. As the day wore on and the crowds changed and the light shifted across the palace courtyard, the guard remained silent, dignified, unbreakable. A reminder that in a world increasingly defined by noise and chaos and the desperate pursuit of attention, there is still power in stillness, strength in silence, and victory in simply refusing to be anything other than what you are meant to be. The confrontation had lasted less than an hour, but its lesson would last a lifetime. Some battles are won not with weapons or words, but with character. Some victories are achieved not through attack, but through steadfast defense of what matters most. And sometimes, the greatest strength is found not in breaking your enemies, but in refusing to be broken by them. The guard had won. But more importantly, he had shown everyone watching in person and online what winning really looked like. It wasn't about humiliating your opponent or destroying their reputation or generating clicks and views. It was about standing for something that mattered, about maintaining your integrity under pressure, about being the person you were meant to be regardless of what others thought or said or did. In the end, that was the true victory, not the defeat of Ethan Harper, but the affirmation of everything he stood against: honor over dishonor, service over selfishness, truth over lies, dignity over degradation, purpose over profit. And as the sun set over London and the guard's shift finally ended, as he marched away with the same precise steps that had carried him to his post that morning, the courtyard fell quiet once more. But it was not empty. It was filled with the echo of his words, the memory of his courage, and the promise that some things, the best things, can never be defeated by those who profit from their destruction. The story would be told and retold, shared and reshared, remembered and cherished, not as entertainment, but as inspiration, not as content, but as truth, not as spectacle, but as testimony to the power of standing firm in the face of those who would tear down everything decent and honorable about human nature. The guard had won, but in winning he had given something far more valuable than victory. He had given hope, hope that dignity still exists in the world, hope that some people still choose service over self-promotion, hope that truth, when spoken with authority and backed by genuine character, can still cut through all the noise and chaos and artificial controversy that defines so much of modern life. And in that hope, everyone who witnessed the confrontation in person or online found something they might not have even known they were looking for: proof that heroism doesn't always wear a cape, that courage doesn't always roar, and that the greatest victories are often won not by those who speak the loudest, but by those who stand the firmest when everything around them is trying to make them fall.